Hi, AmericaToday.tv presents the Global Security and Intelligence Reports by Stratfor.com. This week's selection is by Scott Stewart and it's entitled Mexico, the Struggle for Balance. This week's Geopolitical Intelligence Report provided a high-level assessment of the economic forces that affect how the Mexican people and the Mexican government view the flow of narcotics through that country. Certainly at that macro level, there is a lot of money flowing into Mexico, and a lot of people, from bankers and businessmen to political parties and politicians, are benefiting from massive influx of cash. The lure of this lucre shapes how many Mexicans, particularly many of the Mexican elite, view narcotics trafficking. It is, frankly, a good time to be a banker, a real estate developer, or a Rolex dealer in Mexico. However, at the tactical level, there are a number of issues also shaping the opinions of many Mexicans regarding narcotics trafficking, including violence, corruption, and rapidly rising domestic narcotics consumption. At this level, people are being terrorized by running gun battles, mass beheadings, and rampant kidnappings, the types of events that Stratfor covers in our Mexico security memos. Mexican elites have the money to buy armored cars and hire private security guards, but rampant corruption in the security forces means the common people seemingly have nowhere to turn for help at the local level. Not an uncommon occurrence in the developing world. The violence is also having a heavy impact on Mexico's tourist sector and on the willingness of foreign companies to invest in Mexico's manufacturing sector. Many smaller business owners are being hit from two sides. They receive extortion demands from criminals while facing a decrease in revenue due to a drop in tourism because of the crime and violence. These citizens and businessmen are demanding help from Mexico City. These two opposing forces, the inexorable flow of huge quantities of cash and the pervasive violence, corruption, and fear, are placing a tremendous amount of pressure on the Calderon administration. And this pressure will only increase as Mexico moves closer to the 2012 presidential elections. President Felipe Calderon was the law and order candidate and was elected in 2006 in large part due to his pledge to end cartel violence. Faced by these forces, Calderon needs to find a way to strike a delicate balance, one that will reassert Mexican government authority, quell the violence, and mollify the public while also allowing the river of illicit cash to continue flowing into Mexico. And an examination of the historical dynamics of the narcotics trade in Mexico reveals that in order for the violence to stop, there needs to be a balance among the various drug trafficking organizations involved in the trade. New dynamics have begun to shape the narcotics business in Mexico, and they are causing that balance to be very elusive. For the Calderon administration, desperate times may have called for desperate measures. The balance? Well, the laws of economics dictate that narcotics will continue to flow into the United States. The mission of the Mexican drug trafficking organizations and the larger cartels they form is to attempt to control as much of that flow as they can. The people who run the Mexican drug trafficking organizations are businessmen. Historically, their primary objective is to move their product, narcotics, without being caught and to make a lot of money in the process. The Mexican drug lords have traditionally attempted to conduct this business quietly, efficiently, and with the least amount of friction. When there is a kind of competitive business balance among these various organizations, a sort of détente prevails and there is relative peace. We say relative because there has always been a level of tension and some level of violence among these organizations. But during times of balance, the violence is kept in check for business reasons. During times of balance, the territorial boundaries are well established, the smuggling corridors are secure, the drugs flow, and the people make money. When that balance is lost, an organization is weakened, especially an organization that controls one or more valuable smuggling corridors. A vicious fight can develop as other organizations move in and try to exert control over the territory, and the incumbent organization attempts to fight them off and retain control of its turf. Smuggling corridors are geographically significant places along the narcotics supply chain where the product is channeled, such as ports, airstrips, significant highways, and border crossings. Control of these significant channels, often referred to as plazas by the drug trafficking organizations, is very important to an organization's ability to move contraband. If it doesn't control a corridor it wants to use, it must pay the organization that does control it. In past decades, this turbulence was normally short lived. When there was a fight between the organizations or cartels, there would be a period of intense violence, and then the balance between them would either be restored or to the status quo, or a new balance between the organizations would be reached. For example, when the Guadalajara cartel dissolved following the 1989 arrest of Miguel Angel Feliz Gallardo and the Arellano Feliz organization, the AFO, and the Sinaloa cartel emerged from the Guadalajara cartel to fill the power vacuum, there was a brief period of tension. But once balance was achieved, the violence ebbed, and the business returned to normal. However, the model of the cartel conflicts has changed. The current round of inter and intra-cartel violence has raged for nearly a decade and has intensified rather than abated. There appears to be no end in sight. In fact, death tolls are far higher today than they were 5 years ago. This inability of the cartels to reach a state of balance is due to several factors. First is the change of products. Mexican drug cartels have long moved marijuana into the United States, but the increase in the amount of cocaine being moved through Mexico in the 1980s and 1990s changed the dynamic. Cocaine is far more compact, far more lucrative than marijuana. Cocaine is also a strategic narcotic, one that has a transnational supply chain far longer than drugs like marijuana or methamphetamine, and that long supply chain is difficult to guard. Because of this, organizations involved in the cocaine trade tend to be more aggressive and violent than those that smuggle drugs with a shorter supply chain, like marijuana or Mexican opium. At first, Mexican cartels like the Guadalajara cartel only smuggled cocaine through their smuggling routes into the United States on behalf of the more powerful Colombian cartels, which were seeking alternate routes to replace the Caribbean smuggling routes that had been largely shut down by American air and sea interdiction efforts. Over time, however, these Mexican cartels grew richer and more powerful from the proceeds of the cocaine trade, and they began to take on an expanded role in cocaine trafficking. The efforts of the Colombian government to dismantle the large and violent organizations like the Medellin and the Cali cartels also allowed the Mexicans to assume more control over the cocaine supply line. Today, Mexican cartels control much of the cocaine supply chain, with their influence reaching down into South America and up to the United States. This expanded control of the supply chain brought with it a larger slice of the profits for the Mexican cartels, so they have become even more rich, more powerful. Of course, this large quantity of illicit income also brings risk with it. The massive profits that can be made by controlling a smuggling corridor into the United States are a tempting lure to competitors, internal and external. This means that the cartels require enforcers to protect their personnel and operations. These enforcers and the escalation of violence they brought with them are a second factor that has hampered the ability of the cartels to reach a balance. Initially, some of the cartel bosses served as their own muscle, but as time went by and the business need for violence increased, the cartels brought in hired help to carry out the enforcement function. The first cartel to do this on a large scale was the AFO, a very aggressive organization, which used active and current police officers and youth gangs, some of them actually from the U.S. side of the border, as enforcers. To counter the AFO's innovation and strength, rival cartels soon hired their own muscle. The Juarez cartel created its own band of police, called La Línea, And the Gulf Cartel took things yet another step and hired Los Zetas, a group of elite